note to the listeners, episode 18 contains some explicit language. A Junior Whopper, please, with cheese, by James Hartman. This guy, wearing dark corduroy pants, a heavy black sweater, and one of those soft winter hats nearly covering his whole face in the South Florida heat of Delray Beach, always perched himself on the corner of Atlantic and Congress, holding a cardboard sign asking in sloppy curves for a Junior Whopper from Burger King, please, with cheese. His clothes were ripped, and his exposed skin was blistered and tattooed with scars. The sign never asked for money, a job, or a place to sleep. Just a Junior Whopper from Burger King, with cheese. I watched him, as I always did when I drove by. Some people at work downtown believed him to be homeless, suffering from obvious mental illness. They said he didn't even know what the sign he held up read. Probably wasn't even his. I started waving to him, but he never acknowledged me. Sometimes kids walking by pointed and kicked pebbles at him, but he never acknowledged them either. "What's your obsession?" David, my manager, said one shift after I asked him if he remembered the first time he'd seen him. David grew up in Delray, and now lived with his wife over the restaurant in a small studio apartment. "He's just another homeless dude, man." He glanced at an order, then chastised the chef for not following something. The chef took the plate and went about redoing it. What would happen, I said more to myself than to him, if someone gave him one? "One what?" David faced me. "A Junior Whopper, with cheese." His expression contorted in thought. He looked away before shrugging at me with a grin. His head would explode? "It isn't funny," I said. He laughed, accepted the plate with the new order on it, squinted at it, then squinted at the chef, who slowly raised his middle finger. David saluted him. I had to turn away from that plate. David noticed and touched my arm. "How are things? Any better?" I shook my head. "Take a break," he patted my shoulder. "Snatch some chicken fingers or wings or something." David let me go early, and in my car I called my wife to tell her I'd be home soon. She told me in excited gasps that her family was coming over for dinner to help her bake my favorite meal. "Won't that be fun?" her voice danced through the phone. "Yeah," I just said and hung up. I had first seen the homeless man on December 22nd. Winter doesn't exist down here, but mid-50s are incredibly bitter to our thin blood, so I originally thought he was just cold. Spring and summer came, though, and he didn't shed any of his clothes. Nor did he today, in the heart of August with a 110 heat index. Stepping outside was like sinking into the steam of a swamp. At the intersection of Atlantic and Congress, the light switched, and I stopped. There he was, arms crossed, watching the street with such focus. His sign lay propped up by a stick at his feet. The light switched, and I drove past him. I waved, but he didn't see me. Woozy now, so lightheaded with nothing but what felt like mist in my head, I had to pull over. My palms began to sweat. I tried to re-grip the wheel. My vision fuzzed at the corners. Just over the trees I made out the sign poking through, its big red letters. Without pause, I re-gripped my sweaty hands around the wheel as best I could and drove a little further. "Just a Junior Whopper, please," I told the intercom. "With cheese." "Is that all?" the intercom crackled. "That's all," I said. I drove back down Congress and parked at the little gas station. I stepped out into the swamp of heat. He didn't notice me as I came up right beside him. He stared at the street in defiance, his chin pointed as if protesting all that he saw. I began sweating, wishing I could tell both him and myself why I was there. But all I did was hand him the Junior Whopper, with cheese. Finally, his head sort of twitched, and he looked at my hand. His face was just as blistered and tattooed with scars. Without expression, he took the Junior Whopper and placed it at his feet. "Thank you," he said, and crossed his arms, pointing his chin back at the street. I waited for him to understand what I gave him. Drenched with sweat, I prickled all over from it and the anticipation. But he just stood there, arms crossed, oblivious to me, oblivious to his Junior Whopper with cheese. "There's something wrong with me," my mouth opened. "They don't know what it is, but I can't eat." With each consecutive word I spoke with more strength. "There are these sharp pains right after I swallow, and they don't let up for hours." A blue Suburban glided by as if in slow motion, and I counted 3 heads inside. "I constantly feel painfully stuffed, like I just had one huge Thanksgiving meal." I swallowed. "I can't even remember the last time I ate." I turned to him, sweating. "No one gets it," I said. "No one understands what I'm going through." He looked down like I was still holding out my hand, said "thank you," and recrossed his arms, his chin pointed at the street, defiant. A teenager riding his bike launched a fat watermelon at his sign, splattering it in 2 pieces. But he just watched his street as the teenager pedaled away. I didn't know how long I stood there, but I felt so safe and content I could have stayed beside him forever. Hello everyone! Welcome to No Extra Words, the Flash Fiction Podcast. My name is Chris Baker-Dersch. I'm your producer and editor. I'm kind of at a weird place today because I love these stories, but I don't have a lot to say about them. I sort of want to let them speak for themselves. And so I think I'll just give you a quick update on the podcast and we'll move on from there. Things are going great here at No Extra Words. We are just cooking along. We've been doing weekly episodes since the end of August. We are fully and completely booked with contributors through the end of November, and then we're going to bring you something special and fun in December. There should be a promo coming out for that soon, but I am still looking for some short stories to slot into December. And for December, I have some special requirements. They should be short. I'm talking 750 words or less, and they should be family friendly, and they don't have to be funny, but light is really what we're looking for. So save your deep and dark and dystopian and all those things that I just love, kind of like today's episode, for January, and think if there's something that you have that's fantastical or whimsical, and send it for December. I would love to see it. You can go to noextrawords.wordpress.com. There's a link that says submit your story, send it in like any other, because I'm just trying to fill in a couple of gaps because I think you're going to really love what's coming your way in December. Today's contributors were great to work with. M. Rose Borgerding's story is coming up next. I completely love the last line of her bio, which is she can be found on Facebook or in the First and Collins Starbucks, which I think is awesome. I love it when I get to read author bios and I get these tiny little insight snippets as to what they're like. Like I say, I would like her story, Min Max Out, and James Hartman's A Junior Whopper Please with Cheese to kind of stand on their own. They're pretty deep today. The interesting thing about recording these stories, these flash fiction stories, is so much of the story lives in that moment when it's done. It's like a bell. You stop and it rings. And so these stories have quite a bit of ring to them. And so I don't want to insert my own blobbity-blob about what I think they're about or how they relate to each other. I just kind of want to let them ring. So I tried to let James Hartman's story ring, and I think I'm going to let Min Max Out ring as well. And I will bring it to you now, and I will tell you I'm looking forward to seeing you all next week on No Extra Words. We are going to squeeze in a whole bunch of short shorts next week, so hold on to your socks. I hope you're ready. See you then. Min Max Out by M. Rose Borgerding. Min. You see, even when you see things start on fire, and ghost people standing in the middle of the roads, and the only way to get the ringing phones out of your ears is to slit open your thighs, you're still minimal. The minimal security behavioral unit is great, in that you get to have cards in your room and can wash your own clothes and shower by yourself. Sometimes me and Bianca would whine to the nurses behind the counter, complaining about how we'd gotten only Sprite for the last few days at snack time, and that wearing nicotine patches was not the same as smoking a cigarette. Miss Nancy could never stand for our complaining. In Looney Tunes scrubs and blonde hair dyed straw dry, she was one of the only nurses who bothered to learn that I liked to be called Exa, and Bianca had 2 cavities and could only eat soup and mashed potatoes. When we'd lean up against the plexiglass partition and beg for the keys to the peanut butter cabinet, her chest would puff out, and she'd cross her arms, and her brown eyebrows would shoot up into her hair, and she'd say, "Would you rather be upstairs? In Max?" Max. I remember the screaming on my first night. It was muffled, interrupted by loud bangs that sounded like my father's hand slapping the table. I heard the night nurses' feet shuffle down the hallway as they went to the locked elevator and buzzed themselves up. I would learn the next morning from Miss Nancy that a man named Blake had slammed his head against his window for 15 straight minutes until part of his skull cracked. He wasn't screaming because of the pain, though. He was screaming because the nurses and the security guards were trying to make him leave his room. Blake hadn't even walked out into the hallway of the maximum security behavioral wing for 2 months because he was scared. Miss Nancy couldn't tell me much because even though she loved to gossip, she did try to maintain some sort of distance from all of us. Plus, she wanted to keep some of Blake's integrity through confidentiality. From the little she said, though, I could guess on what was written on Blake's diagnostic sheet. Paranoia, not otherwise specified. Psychosis, not otherwise specified. You only stay in the wings for longer than 2 weeks if they don't know what's wrong with you. Not otherwise specified is doctor code for who fucking knows. Out. I would be bartending out by Boston University when I'd meet a man with teal hair talking about his time in the behavioral unit over at Mass General. I would mention my own time there, but instead of asking the usual question, what are you in for, like in prison, he asked, which wing? When I said Min, he just laughed and his hands shook as he slapped down a 5 for another beer. So you weren't crazy. You were just rich and had nothing better to do. The teal-haired man wasn't right. There is a lot wrong with my brain and Bianca's brain and every other person who slid their socks down the hall of men. But in a way he had a point. We were only there because we'd forgotten to take our meds, because we'd let our scars veer into the sight of our parents, because we were too stubborn to stop drinking or shooting heroin or snorting meth. A lot of us could dilute the crazy. Most of us would leave the wing to go back to jobs and wives and trust funds. The teal-haired man kept glancing over his shoulder before he quickly walked, half-ran from the bar with his jacket pulled up over his head. I didn't get the chance to ask if his name was Blake.